Okay, good afternoon. Welcome back. I'd like to start by expressing my shock and concern at the news of the devastating bomb attacks in Moscow's busiest airport yesterday. On behalf of the government and the people of New Zealand, I want to express my condolences to the Russian people. I note it is of huge concern that the attack on ordinary civilians was almost certainly instigated by terrorists. Our thoughts are with all of those affected by this tragedy, and I join other leaders from around the world in condemning those responsible. I've written to Russian President Dmitry Medvedev this afternoon to formally offer our heartfelt condolences at this time of immense sorrow. As Foreign Minister Murray McCully has said in his press release today, our embassy in Moscow has been contacting New Zealanders registered with MFAT as being in the city, and there are currently no reports of New Zealanders caught up in the blast. As you know, today was the first cabinet of 2011. This year, the government's primary focus will, of course, be on the economy. Tomorrow, I'll be delivering my first speech of the year, which will broadly set out our economic agenda. We will be pressing ahead with the next steps in our six-point economic program to underpin the fast and lasting growth we need to support jobs and higher incomes. This year, our program will focus on savings and investment. Simply put, we need to increase our national savings so we can control our destiny as a country. Our high level of foreign debt is New Zealand's biggest vulnerability. I'll go into more detail on where the government will be taking action tomorrow. I'll also be setting out further government priorities in the speech from the throne when Parliament resumes on the 8th of February. A few more dates for your diary. There will be a full caucus at Premier House on Wednesday the 2nd of February. At the end of the week I'll be travelling north for Waitangi commemorations on February the 5th and 6th. In terms of also for your diaries, Thursday night is the final National Party candidate selection meeting for the Botany by-election. There's a good field of quality candidates, and National is looking forward to running a strong campaign for the seat of Botany. Questions?
Prime Minister, what are your feelings on the minimum wage this year? How much should they go up?
Well, Cabinet will be considering the matter of the minimum wages law requires. My guess is that there's likely to be a modest adjustment, but one that reflects the economic conditions that we find ourselves in. But we haven't considered that matter yet. We'll do so in one of the cabinets coming up in the start of the year.
Do you think there's a stronger case this year with the rise in GST of another 2.5% there? Can you take that into account?
No, that has been taken account of in a number of places, but those on the minimum wage also had tax cuts as well, so we compensated in that area. The minimum wage is a different issue, and that reflects the CPI and other factors that we might want to consider.
Are you up to speed with Phil Goff's opening?
I am. Look, in terms of the promises he's come out with today, quite frankly, they're fiscally irresponsible, and they show a complete lack of understanding of the financial position New Zealand finds itself in and the state of our government books. He is essentially arguing that he'll be borrowing for tax cuts, and not a small amount, an enormous amount. On our numbers, he's short by at least $1.1 billion a year. That's money that has to be borrowed. It's money that has to be repaid with interest. It's money that New Zealand cannot afford to borrow. Will almost certainly be downgraded as a result of that program. Interest rates will rise. It's particularly poor tax policy, and quite frankly, it's not even the end of January, and Labor are $1.1 billion in the hole. And I think you'll see from our speech tomorrow that, quite frankly, clearly the national government is taking a completely different perspective on the fiscal responsibility that's required to get New Zealand going.
How do you calculate the $1.1 billion?
Sorry?
How do you calculate?
Yeah, so basically the cost of a tax-free threshold is $1.3 billion. If you apply the top personal rate of 38% at $120,000, you raise about $320 million. They are in the gun for $250 million for GST. He's saying they're going to ring-fence losses on property. The most generous assessment we saw of that when we looked at that was a $260 million benefit. That of that $260 million you could gain, the advice we got was that sophisticated investors will structure their way around that very easily, which is why we didn't do it. At best, you might raise $130 million if you're lucky. And then the state of the tax system, once you have such an anomaly between the top personal rate, the company rate, and GST off food and various other things going on, means there will be enormous costs. So just the difference between the top personal rate of what he raises and the ring fencing of losses vis-a-vis what you're giving away in the bottom area is, well, it's $1.1 billion a year.
Well, that's talking about an extra $10
Sorry?
a week per person. What do you think of that figure?
Well, look, any tax cut and any increase in income is theoretically welcomed, but that's $10 a week that you'll be getting of your money that the government will have to borrow and have to repay with interest. Your interest rates will rise. Standard & Poor's have put New Zealand on negative outlook and made it quite clear that unless we go on top of our financial position, New Zealand will be downgraded. It's just fiscally irresponsible. We live in New Zealand, not fantasy land. And the fact that the Leader of the Opposition can't stack any of his numbers up show you that he is not thinking about the situation from a position of financial responsibility. He's just simply trying to come up with an election pledge which is totally unaffordable.
So do you think that $10 a week would sway? Do you think that $10 a week would sway any voters, particularly low-income voters?
Well, look, in the end, I think New Zealanders are sensitive to the position we find ourselves in. The government is borrowing $300 million a week. We can't afford to borrow more for tax cuts we can't afford. But most importantly, we need some financial robustness around what we're doing. And we've got a position here where the government is, the government is taking a responsible view. The opposition is basically just saying, I'm going to write cheques I can't afford to cash.
So what's your message going to be to families who, a lot of families are struggling? We're going to have early childcare costs go up 1st of Feb. How can you offer some relief to them, or do you plan to?
Well, the first thing we need to do is make sure that New Zealanders are on a firm footing. That means they've got jobs, that they've got investment, and that New Zealand can attract that investment. And as a result of the sort of policies and the kind of debt that Labor would be running, we would almost certainly not attract that investment, and if we did, we'd have to pay a lot more for it. So there's no magical fairy with a printing press at the end of the New Zealand garden. This is money that would have to be borrowed from overseas, repaid with interest. It's money we can't afford to borrow, all for about $9 or $10 a week. That would be taken off a lot of other New Zealanders with tax increases, but also paid for by all New Zealanders through higher borrowing and interest rate costs.
So you're pretty much saying it's going to be a longer term for people, but there isn't necessarily going to be any relief in the short term, and people are going to have to wear it in the meantime until things readjust.
Well, the strongest thing we can do is put the New Zealand economy on the best footing. That is keep interest rates low. We're working hard to do that. Keep inflation under control, and I think we've done a pretty good job of that actually in the 2 and a bit years we've been in office. Where we have had tax cuts, they have been fiscally neutral or funded. We've been prepared to make savings in areas to fund those. So if you look at real wage growth in the 9 years Labor was in office, it rose by 3% over the entire 9 years. We've achieved a figure almost 3 times that in two years in office. So this is a return by Labor to the policies of borrow, tax and spend. And quite frankly, New Zealand can't afford that. And I think New Zealanders will see through the $10 a week and realise that we're not in a financial position to do this.
What's your reaction to the other parts of the council just increase taxes at the other end over, say, $150?
Well, for a start off, you don't raise an enormous amount of money there. A lot of people will then go back to structuring their affairs. That's what we saw in the past. So, once you have a difference between the trust rate and the top personal rate, then you open yourself wide up to tax avoidance and to people basically structuring their affairs. But even worse than that, ultimately, I think we need some of those high income earners in our economy. We need engineers, we need lawyers, we need accountants, we need doctors, we need school principals. And the message here would be, go and work in another economy.
Do you think it's an envy tax?
Well, I think that's historically sort of been the position that was adopted by Labor. I think at the moment it's the only tangible thing he can put up in a fit of desperation to try and prove that he can afford to pay for this. But look, at the end of the day, if you want to have sensible economic policy, it has to stack up, not just to those who analyse it, but actually to New Zealanders. And when they see a promise for $1.3 billion with $300 million worth of revenue coming in, they know that's a hollow promise. And look, Ring fencing losses, as I say, Labor looked at that in 2005-06 and rejected it for exactly the same reasons we did, that the vast bulk of people can avoid it. Tax avoidance issues, well, we've been throwing a lot of money at that in terms of the budget, in terms of cracking down on those who avoid tax. They should pay their fair share, but we're doing our bit there. So where's the money coming from? Exactly which little pixie is going to deliver that? And the answer is a foreign pixie we borrow it off. And that pixie will want their money back with interest and won't be so keen to lend it to us and will charge you all a lot more for it. So personally, I don't know who wrote this speech, but not someone who's economically literate.
He's alluded in there to, billions of dollars, the tax working group having identified billions of dollars worth of property on which effectively no tax is paid. And he's alluded to, on top of getting rid of ring fencing for losses, other avoidance mechanisms or other tax avoiders that could be cracked down on.
Well, where are they?
Well, that's what I'm asking. Are you aware of there being any?
Look, we commissioned a tax working group with some of the best tax experts from around the country. We made changes for the first time, I might add, in a decade, in areas where we thought it made sense, and that was really around the depreciation allowance and the likes. So the only areas left available are ring fencing of losses, as I say, most people can avoid those, or a capital gains tax or a land tax. That's it. They're your options, and he's not spelling those out.
There's also been a lot of historical resistance to any sort of tax-free zones. And what's the reason for that? What's the sort of problem with tax-free zones?
Yeah, so typically countries that have a tax-free zone, like let's take Australia, I think it's 0 to 6,000 Australia tax-free, they also have a much higher top personal rate, so 37% and 45% respectively in Australia. The second thing is a lot of people who are low-income earners, theoretically, are actually not necessarily low-income by nature. They may not earn a lot of money, they might be a student or a part-time worker, but they're not necessarily, by definition, low-income, not in the way that we would look at it. So in terms of a lot of other things we do in the tax system, if you earn $50,000 or less in New Zealand, you have 2 children, under Working for Families you don't pay tax. So look, we looked years ago at tax-free thresholds. We decided in the end that they certainly weren't efficient. They cost a lot of money and they don't deliver an enormous amount of benefit. And I think if you look at the tax system, you're trying to do 2 things, well, 3 things really. Raise enough revenue to pay the bills. The proposal by Phil Goff does not do that. Put the right incentives in the economy for people to participate, work and get ahead. It does not do that. And have integrity in the tax system to preserve the tax base that people pay it. It does not do that. We are going to have a very higgledy-piggledy tax system if this goes ahead. Tax-free thresholds, high personal rates, dislocation from the trust rate, no tax on fruit and vegetables. I mean, goodness knows what Michael Cullen thinks of it, but I can't see him cheering from his beach house.
Another matter, the Auckland Council and Maori input into
Yep.
planning. Was it the government's intention with the Auckland Council legislation that the statutory Maori committee would be able to appoint 2 members on each committee with full voting rights?
No, it was the policy intent that Auckland Council would be able to determine where they thought it was appropriate that Maori representation should take place with physical and natural resources. And we would have expected that to be a subset of the committees that are going to be established in Auckland, which are about 20 in nature. Now, my understanding is that the statutory board are having discussions with the Auckland Council, and we would encourage them to have those discussions and see if they can find a solution that is acceptable to everybody.
So is it not your impression that that's the case, that they will be able to have 2 members on each committee with voting rights?
Well, in the end, Auckland's a master of its own destiny. It's free to do that if it wants to, but the policy intent was quite clear that, and I might add, the policy intent in one form or another has been in place since 1977. It was specifically written into the legislation because of Auckland, but it's not actually new. So the policy intent is that where it was deemed appropriate for natural and physical resources, Maori would have that opportunity to participate and vote on those boards, those committees, but not necessarily all of them. And as I say, we'll leave it to Auckland and see whether they can resolve that issue.
With the statutory board saying it has a legal opinion that it's entitled to do that?
Well, let's just see whether they can resolve the issue themselves.
By resolve, do you mean not having a vote on every committee?
Well, that is in the end for Auckland to determine what they think is appropriate. But the the policy intent from the government wasn't that that would mean that Maori would be represented on every committee. We wouldn't have thought that that is the likely outcome.
Well, do you think you'll need to revisit the legislation and clarify it?
I don't think that's likely.
Guys, we have a question from Duncan on, wants to know whether you've ever dyed your hair.
No. And I constantly read about myself going greyer. There's very little I can do about that, but no. It goes a little lighter when the sun is out and I'm allowed to wander around outside, but outside that's 100% el natural.
Would you think,
It's falling out, but it's not changing colour.
would you think any less of Mr. Bob if he started doing it?
No, I wouldn't. I'd think more about that than his economic policies, that's for sure.
Prime Minister, just coming back to the minimum wage, what's your message to the 100,000 or so people who are on the minimum wage, looking at an inflation rate of 4%, who may be hopeful of more than a modest increase on the minimum wage?
Well, the first important point is that the inflation rate at 4% reflects the fact that there was a one-off adjustment for GST, and the Reserve Bank Governor looks through that, and there was an adjustment for all New Zealanders through the tax system to reflect half of that. So then the second bit of it, the generalised inflation rate, that's been the basis that the national government has used for making changes in the minimum wage. And I might add, we have changed the minimum wage on two occasions we've been asked to consider it, and we'll look at it on the third occasion very soon. But I think it's also important to understand one thing. There is a natural trade-off between the minimum wage and the desirability for employers to employ people. If we were to move, for instance, let's say to $15 today, then the advice we've had is that a considerable number of people would lose their job. From memory, it's 6,000 to 8,000 people. So we want New Zealanders to earn more, but legislating their way to achieve that is not long-term a solution to our issues. We need to have good economic policy, good infrastructure, good skills, a good tax system that works, an outward-facing economy, low levels of debt. And I think if you do all of those things over time, we'll lift people off the minimum wage. But if it's as simple as legislation, then previous governments would have done it.
So to that person, that cleaner or street sweeper who's on the minimum wage and doesn't get a rise that they see as commensurate with how their living costs have gone up, you're saying to them, you've got a tax cut?
Well, I'm saying there's different things happening here. The minimum wage has typically been adjusted to reflect the CPI, and that may well be the case in terms of the way we consider it this time. Cabinet hasn't considered that, so I can't comment on that at this point, but that's typically been the basis that we've made that decision on. And we've moved quite a long way in the 2 years we've been in office in difficult economic conditions. I have no reason to believe that we won't make an adjustment again. So obviously, we want people to earn more, and we're doing everything we can to do that, including cutting their taxes and trying to strengthen the economy. But we also want to keep them in work. And I think when you ask New Zealanders what's more important, slightly more in the minimum wage or keeping their job, most New Zealanders will vote for keeping their job. Now, over time, people transition off the minimum wage typically to higher incomes, and we want to encourage that.
So are you saying if you make an adjustment on the CPI, you discount the GST increase, which you've already compensated for? So you're looking at around 2%, is that ballpark?
That could be, yeah.
Well, will that be the same for pensions and benefits?
Well, they already get their adjustment through an immediate adjustment on the GST increase that happened at the time. And in terms of the way pensions are adjusted, yes, there's a formula that they go and look at in terms of the inflation rate and the floor, and depending which
so
is.
they get a CPI adjustment.
They get a CPI
well.
adjustment.
So that would be the same, like you would strip out the
Management
effect
side.
of the GST increase.
Yeah. Uncompensated increases.
Whether or not bringing the SAS out of Afghanistan was discussed at Cabinet?
No, the SAS, was that the question?
Yeah, or
Right. Yeah, okay, yes. No, it wasn't discussed at Cabinet today, but it's likely to be discussed in the very foreseeable future, potentially next week at Cabinet.
Did you talk to William Hague and Dr Fox about the SAS extension and the PRT?
We did. So I talked to them and said that we're considering that matter, and that Cabinet would have a view on that in the early part of the next few weeks. They expressed their appreciation for the work that the SAS are doing in Afghanistan. I also reflected to them our situation in Bamiyan province, and they were fairly up to date with what was happening there in the situation, and we talked about the likely time frame for commitment of resources there and the handover of that province. So there was a wide I guess I'd describe it as wide-ranging discussion about the issues in Afghanistan, and I think both countries, like all of ISAF and NATO partners, face similar issues there. I mean, we'd all like to exit as soon as we can. It's a matter of working our way through that and making sure we preserve the work that we've done there and hopefully deliver a more stable environment in Afghanistan that's lasting.
And did they express a view about spending the SAs?
Well, I think given the commitment of resources that the British have there, of course they would want us to stay there longer, so that's a natural position for them to adopt. But in the end, they recognise it's for New Zealand to make that decision.
Did you talk today at all about NCEA and state schools in particular?
No, we didn't actually.
What's your view of what's happening with Auckland Grammar?
Well, I guess it's what I'd say is, firstly, I think for the most part NCEA has settled down and is actually working well. It, just like Cambridge or baccalaureate, won't suit every child, but for the bulk of New Zealand children I actually think it's delivering good outcomes, and we're seeing no difference in the ability of young New Zealanders to either go to universities or gain a first-class education, irrelevant of whatever system they're using. I mean, it's no secret also that Auckland Grammar has never been a great fan of NCEA. I mean, historically, about 2/3 of the youngsters in Year 1 have not been participating in NCEA, and they've really pushed that extension slightly out. That's a choice that John Morris and the board have taken, and maybe it will suit their students, but I think they would want to stay close to their parents, because not every student at Auckland Grammar will be suited to studying and having Cambridge as their assessment method.
So what happens to them?
Well, that's my point. I mean, in the end, schools need to reflect, I think, what their parents' expectations are.
Are there any concerns about other schools following suit that Auckland Grammar might have kind of led the way on it?
We're not really seeing that. I mean, there are a number of state schools that have and do offer alternatives, but you've seen from some quite leading academics and principals that an indication that they're not intending to make significant changes.
So would you prefer at Auckland Grammar to still see the NCEA offer as an option as well as Cambridge rather than it being knocked out?
Well, they are technically probably meeting their legal obligations in that they are offering it. I guess it's the way in which it's being offered.
What happens to a student that doesn't pass those Cambridge exams? Are they then able to proceed to the next level, or do they have to redo it?
You have to take that up with the school. I assume they redo it actually. I mean, it'd be difficult to see them moving from there. I think it's A levels to O levels, isn't it? In terms of the Cambridge system, if you don't pass your starting.
No, but could they then go to the next year and do NCEA too?
Don't know. You'd need to take that up with school.
Just given those fiscal constraints that you were talking about earlier, with Mr. Goff's speech, and also looking ahead to the Savings Working Group releasing their report, how much can we realistically expect from you tomorrow? You've said that the focus will be around savings and investment, and not only tomorrow, but for the rest of the year. I mean, what options are there available to government?
Well, we have identified that New Zealand has some clear vulnerabilities, and they are in relation to not only the amount of borrowing, but the vulnerability to the external nature of that borrowing. And realistically, everyone can see that. So if you look at the external liabilities of New Zealand, they're around about 85% of GDP. The only countries that have a similar profile that looks like that are Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Greece. And that is not happy company to be in. Now, New Zealand's profile is more like Spain, in other words, relatively low government debt and relatively high private sector debt, but we can see the pressure Spain is under, and we've already seen Standard & Poor's give an indication that unless there is an improvement in our economic outlook in that regard, we will be downgraded.
Don't you open yourself up to political criticism by talking about savings and the clear need for it and the importance, but you've reduced the KiwiSaver scheme, not paying into the superannuation? I mean, aren't those vehicles that could be used to do exactly that?
Well, firstly, if you're just borrowing for those, then you're not increasing national savings. So that's the first point. Secondly, I actually believe we've increased the participation of KiwiSaver by making it more accessible for people by having a lower entry point and more affordable for companies to stay in there. So I would reject the view that we've altered in that regard. And thirdly, we've cut the cloth that we believe that we can afford. So we'd all agree that savings is a complex issue of how you lift national savings. All I can say is that there are a couple of component parts, and they are the amount that the government spends and where it funds that spending from, and the options available for the private sector.
So superannuation, resuming those superannuation payments is not a priority. I mean, Bill English has obviously said that you'd look at resuming them when the
That's right.
books come right, but that's not going to become any more urgent priority given this focus.
No, and that's because it wouldn't change national savings if we're simply borrowing it. We've made a commitment that as soon as we return to surpluses, we'll start making payments back into the super fund.
On your figures, I guess Labour could be borrowing about 1 billion more a year. So borrowings would go up from, and maths isn't always the best, but 300 million to about 320 million a week. Is that going to break the bank?
Yeah, but don't forget though that the deficit we're currently running is to June 30, 2011. It quite rapidly starts reducing from there, and we actually, on our current forecast, get back to surplus by 2015-16. So that's certainly not the case. Secondly, I'm being pretty generous today because I haven't actually added in all the other things that they've promised. I mean, last week they were in the paper arguing that they were going to have an extension of paid parental leave. They were also saying they're going to extend working for families for under twos. David Cunliffe was saying that they're not going to take dividends from energy generators. They're talking about increasing subsidies for R&D tax credits, and it's January.
So you're saying that will build
Goodness
in,
knows what February will roll in.
Yeah. Go back to the extra $1 billion though, you're saying that that will build in some sort of extra structural borrowing that the government can currently see its way through.
Well, let's put another perspective on it. Dr. Cullen increased new budget spending by about $2.8 billion a year, every year for the last 5 years on average of his time as Finance Minister. We've trimmed that to $1.1 billion. Phil Goff has doubled that this afternoon. That's an awful lot of money to go out there and borrow. I mean, I'd have some respect for it if at least there was honesty about where it stacks up and where the money comes from. But the truth of it is, they haven't got a clue other than people that don't live in New Zealand. And we already owe them more than enough money. Thanks very much.